Close on Elowen standing in the middle of a ruined house, muddy water covering the floor. She holds a rusted tool. In the background, sounds of frogs and rain falling on the swamp. They called her the widow of the swamp. When Elowen's husband died, the whole town laughed. He'd spent every penny buying a ruined house in the middle of a stinking swamp, the kind of place nobody wanted even for free. Everyone said he was crazy, that he'd wasted his life. And now Elowen was alone in that wet hell, literally sinking in the mud. The powerful men of the region lined up at her door. They offered crumbs for the property. Just accept it, Elowen. This place is worthless. It's just a hole full of mud and mosquitoes. You'll die here if you stay. They laughed at her, treated her like trash, like someone who didn't deserve even pity. But what those arrogant men didn't know, what nobody imagined, is that Elowen's husband wasn't crazy. He was a genius. And that rotten house in the middle of the swamp, it wasn't sinking in just any mud. It was built exactly over the secret heart of the entire region. When Elowen started digging under the rotting beams to save the house from collapsing, her hands touched something that shouldn't be there. Metal, gears, an entire system hidden under decades of sludge. And when she finally cleaned the dirt and saw what her husband had left her, she realized the devastating truth. She didn't inherit a ruin. She inherited control of all the water in the valley, the luxury farms, the million-dollar resorts, the mansions of the men who laughed at her, all depended on a drainage system that ran under that useless house. And now Elowen had the floodgates in her hands. If she wanted, she could close everything, and in 24 hours those men's empires would be underwater. Before I show you how Elowen transformed a rotten house into a throne of power, and how the men who humiliated her had to beg on their knees for mercy, subscribe to the channel now, because today you'll learn that underestimating a broken widow can be the most expensive mistake of your life, and that sometimes what looks like garbage is holding the power that destroys empires. Elowen Marsh was 67 years old when her husband Thomas died, and in the 3 days between his death and his funeral, she learned exactly what the town really thought of them both. Thomas had been called eccentric at best, insane at worst, for the past 30 years. The couple had never fit in with the comfortable society of Millbrook Valley, a prosperous region in rural Georgia, where old money and new development lived side by side. The valley was beautiful, rolling hills, clear streams, fertile farmland that had made families wealthy for generations, and at the center of it all, controlling much of the land and most of the development, were the Hendersons, the Pratts, and the Blackwoods, 3 families who'd turned their inherited land into resorts, luxury farms, and exclusive residential developments. Thomas and Elowen had lived modestly on the outskirts of town for most of their marriage. Thomas worked as a civil engineer, quietly, without fanfare. Elowen had been a school teacher. They'd never had children, never sought social status, never tried to join the country club or the development associations. They were simply there, living their lives, bothering no one. Then 30 years ago, Thomas did something that made the whole valley talk. He took their life savings, every penny they'd accumulated over decades of careful living, and bought a property that everyone knew was worthless. It was a house and 5 acres deep in the dark water swamp, a miserable wetland on the eastern edge of the valley that flooded regularly, bred mosquitoes constantly, and had defeated every attempt at development for 100 years. The house itself was a ruin even then, a structure built in the 1890s that had been abandoned for decades. The foundation was sinking, the walls were rotting, the land around it was a maze of stagnant water, dense vegetation, and mud that could swallow a person. Nobody understood why Thomas wanted it. When people asked, he'd just smile and say it was a good investment. People thought he'd lost his mind. The social matriarchs of Millbrook Valley whispered about poor Elowen, married to a man who'd thrown away their future on a swamp. The developers tried to buy it from him immediately, offering slightly more than he'd paid, assuming he'd realize his mistake. Thomas refused every offer. He and Elowen didn't move to the swamp house. It was unlivable, but Thomas spent every weekend there for 30 years. He'd drive out in his old truck, spend hours in the swamp and come home covered in mud. Elowen never questioned him. She trusted Thomas completely. If he said the property mattered, it mattered. She didn't need to understand why. Now Thomas was gone, dead of a heart attack at 71, and Elowen was discovering just how little the town had respected either of them. At the funeral, the condolences were thin and fake. "At least now you can sell that awful swamp property," one woman said, patting Elowen's hand. "Put this all behind you." "Such a shame Thomas wasted your money like that," another added. "But you're free now." Elowen said nothing. She accepted their hollow sympathy and planned her next move. 3 days after the funeral, Marcus Henderson came to her house. Marcus was 45, heir to the Henderson development fortune, and the driving force behind most of the valley's recent growth. He was handsome, confident, and utterly sure of his own importance. "Mrs. Marsh," he said, sitting in her modest living room without being invited. "I wanted to express my condolences personally, and to make you an offer." "An offer?" Elowen asked quietly. "For the Darkwater property. I know Thomas was attached to it, but it's a burden now. 5 acres of swamp and a house that should have been condemned decades ago. I'm prepared to offer you $20,000. That's more than fair for worthless wetland." Elowen looked at him steadily. "Thomas paid $18,000 for it 30 years ago." "Exactly. So you'd make a small profit. More than that land deserves, honestly. Take the money, Mrs. Marsh. Use it to make your life comfortable. That swamp will only drag you down." "I'll think about it," Elowen said. Marcus's smile tightened. "Don't think too long. The offer won't stay on the table forever. And frankly, you don't have many options. You're 67 years old, widowed, living on a teacher's pension. That swamp is worthless to you. Sell it while someone's still willing to buy." He left, and Elowen sat alone in her house, thinking about Thomas. About 30 years of weekend trips to the swamp, about a brilliant civil engineer who everyone called crazy, about a man who'd never done anything without a reason. 2 days later, Elowen packed everything she owned into Thomas's old truck and drove out to the Darkwater swamp property. If the town thought she was crazy before, they'd be certain now. She was moving into the ruin. She was going to find out why Thomas had spent 30 years in that swamp. And she had a feeling that Marcus Henderson's eagerness to buy the property meant it was worth far more than anyone was saying. The house was worse than Elowen remembered. She'd been out here a few times over the years, bringing Thomas lunch or checking on him during particularly long days, but she'd never really looked at the structure itself, never paid attention to how bad the decay had become. Now, standing in front of it with her truck packed full of her belongings, she saw it clearly. The house was sinking. The entire structure tilted slightly to the east, the foundation on that side having subsided into the soft wetland soil. The porch sagged dangerously. The roof had holes. The windows were either broken or missing entirely. Inside was worse. The floor was covered in an inch of stagnant water that had seeped up through the floorboards. The walls were black with mold. The ceiling was collapsing in places. The smell was overwhelming. Rot and decay and the thick organic stench of swamp water. Elowen stood in what had once been a living room and felt despair try to take hold. How was she supposed to live here? She was 67 years old. She had no construction skills. She had a teacher's pension that barely covered basic expenses. This place was impossible. But then she heard Thomas's voice in her memory from a conversation years ago. Sometimes, he'd said, the most valuable things look worthless to everyone else. That's how you know they're really valuable, because if everyone could see their worth, they'd already be gone. Elowen set down her bags and got to work. She couldn't fix everything, but she could make one room livable. She chose the smallest bedroom, which was slightly higher than the rest of the house and relatively dry. She cleaned the mold, patched the worst holes in the walls with plastic sheeting, set up a camping cot and battery-powered lantern. It was miserable, but it was hers. That first night, lying on the cot and listening to the sounds of the swamp, frogs croaking, insects buzzing, water lapping against the foundation, Elowen cried. For Thomas, for the life they'd had, for the impossibility of her situation. But she didn't leave. The next morning, Marcus Henderson returned. This time he brought 2 other men, Robert Pratt and James Blackwood, the other major developers in the valley. They pulled up in Marcus's luxury SUV, completely inappropriate for the muddy track that led to the house. "Mrs. Marsh," Marcus called out. "We heard you'd actually moved in here. That can't be true." Elowen came out onto the sagging porch. "It's true." The three men looked at each other in disbelief. "This is insane," Robert Pratt said. "You can't live here. This house is a death trap." "I'm managing," Elowen said calmly. "Look," James Blackwood said, trying a softer approach. "We understand this is difficult, losing your husband, being alone, but you need to be realistic. This property is worthless. The land is wetland, it can't be developed. The house is beyond repair. You're throwing away whatever time you have left on something that will never be anything but a swamp." "Then why do you care if I stay?" Elowen asked. The three men exchanged glances. "We're planning a major development project," Marcus finally said. "The entire Eastern Valley. Luxury homes, a golf course, a resort. We need to acquire all the properties in the area to make it work. Your swamp is right in the middle of our planned drainage corridor. We're willing to pay you fairly for it. $30,000. Final offer." "No," Elowen said. "Excuse me?" "No, I'm not selling." Marcus's friendly facade cracked. "Don't be stupid. You're going to die in this swamp. We're offering you money. Real money. Take it. Leave my property," Elowen said quietly. The three men stared at her in shock. Nobody said no to them. Nobody defied the developers who controlled the valley. "You'll regret this," Marcus said coldly. "When this place kills you, don't come crying to us." They left, their SUV spraying mud as they drove away too fast. Elowen watched them go and felt something shift inside her. They wanted this land desperately, which meant Thomas had been right. It was valuable. She just had to figure out why. That afternoon, Elowen began truly exploring the property. The 5 acres were a maze of water channels, dense vegetation, and mud. But as she moved carefully through it, she began to notice things. The water flowed in specific directions, following channels that looked almost too regular to be natural. There were old stone markers at certain points, nearly hidden by vegetation. And the house itself, despite its terrible condition, was positioned very precisely, exactly at the center of the property, at the point where multiple water channels converged. Thomas had been a civil engineer. He understood water flow, drainage, infrastructure. What had he seen here that nobody else had? Elowen returned to the house as the sun was setting. She was covered in mud, exhausted, and had mosquito bites on every exposed inch of skin. But she was energized. There was something here, something Thomas had known about. She was going to find it. That night she pulled out Thomas's old work journals, which she'd brought with her. Page after page of technical notes, diagrams, calculations. Most of it was beyond her understanding, but one phrase appeared over and over: central valve point. Elowen didn't know what it meant, but she knew where to look for answers. Under the house, where the water channels converged, where Thomas had spent 30 years working in secret. The next morning, Elowen began the most difficult physical work of her life. She needed to access the space under the house, which meant clearing away decades of accumulated mud and debris. The foundation was stone, laid directly on the swamp soil. There was no proper crawl space, just a gap of maybe 2 feet between the ground and the floor joists. Elowen got down on her hands and knees in the mud and started pulling away vegetation and sludge from around the foundation. It was disgusting, exhausting work. Her back screamed, her hands were cut and blistered. Mud got into her clothes, her hair, her mouth. She was 67 years old and she was digging in a swamp like a madwoman. If the town could see her now, they'd have her committed. But as she cleared away the muck, she found something that made her stop cold. Metal, not just random debris. A smooth metal surface, clearly man-made, set into the foundation stones. Elowen's heart began to race. She dug faster, pulling away years of accumulated sediment. The metal surface extended for several feet. It was some kind of cover or hatch, and it was locked. Elowen spent the next 3 hours clearing enough space to fully expose the metal hatch. It was about 4 feet square, made of heavy iron that had been treated to resist corrosion. There was a lock mechanism that looked incredibly complex. Not a simple padlock, but an intricate system of gears and catches. Thomas had built this, or modified it. This was what he'd been working on for 30 years. Ellawen sat back in the mud, exhausted and exhilarated. She didn't have the key or combination to open this lock, but she knew someone who might have left her the information. Thomas. She returned to his journals and went through them methodically, page by page. And there, tucked into a journal from 15 years ago, she found it. A small envelope marked, "For Ellawen." Inside was a hand-drawn diagram of the lock mechanism and instructions for opening it. Beneath that, Thomas had written, "My dearest Ellawen, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you're at the house. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you everything while I was alive, but some knowledge is dangerous and I wanted to protect you. This property isn't a swamp. It's the key to the entire valley's water system. Everything I've built here will be yours now. Use it wisely. Use it to protect yourself. And if those who tried to take advantage of us come for you, show them that the widow of the swamp holds more power than all their money and arrogance combined. I love you. I trust you. Always. Thomas." Ellawen read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her muddy face. Then she took the diagram and went back to the hatch. Following Thomas's instructions precisely, she manipulated the lock mechanism. It took 15 minutes of careful work, turning specific gears in a specific sequence. Then, with a deep metallic click that echoed in the swamp silence, the lock released. Ellawen pulled open the heavy hatch. Beneath it, stone steps descended into darkness, and from below came the sound of rushing water. Ellawen climbed down the stone steps carefully, one hand gripping the rough brick wall for balance, the other holding her phone with its flashlight beam cutting through absolute darkness. Each step down felt like descending into another world. The air changed as she went deeper, cooler, damper, carrying a different quality of sound. The steps were worn smooth in the center, where countless feet had walked over more than a century. How many valve keepers had made this descent? How many times had Thomas walked these same steps, keeping his secret, maintaining what everyone thought was just a swamp? The stairs went down about 12 feet, each step carefully measured and precisely laid. Then the narrow stairwell opened into a chamber, and Ellawen stopped on the last step, her breath catching in her throat as her flashlight beam swept across what lay before her. It was a massive underground space, a cathedral of Victorian engineering that took her breath away. The chamber was perhaps 30 feet across and 15 feet high, with walls of red brick laid in perfect courses that had stood for over 130 years without crumbling. The ceiling was vaulted, built with the kind of craftsmanship that modern builders had forgotten, each brick precisely placed to distribute weight, to withstand the pressure of earth and water above. The floor was flagstone, large slate tiles fitted together so perfectly that even after all this time they remained level and solid. But the chamber itself, impressive as it was, wasn't what made Ellawen's hands shake as she stepped fully into the space. What filled her with awe, with a mixture of terror and exhilaration, was what the chamber contained. An intricate, beautiful, terrifying system of water control spread before her like a mechanical masterpiece. The chamber was built at the intersection of multiple underground streams. Ellawen could see at least 6 different channels carved into the floor, each one carefully lined with brick, each one carrying water from different directions. The water flowed constantly, a complex symphony of liquid movement. Some channels ran fast and loud, white water rushing over stone. Others moved slowly, deep and dark and quiet. And all of them passed through this central hub, controlling everything, directing the flow, managing the volume, determining where each stream went when it left this room, was a complex system of metal gates and valves that looked like something from a steampunk dream. Cast iron wheels, some as large as Ellawen was tall, lever mechanisms with brass handles polished smooth by decades of use, gate systems that could be raised or lowered to block or allow water flow, pipe junctions where water could be redirected from one channel to another. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. It was power made manifest in metal and water and stone. Ellawen walked slowly around the chamber, her flashlight beam revealing detail after detail. Each valve was labeled with a brass plate, green with age but still legible. Henderson North Properties Drainage, Blackwood Resort Primary Flow, Pratt Farmland Eastern Channels, Valley Road Residential District. Name after name, property after property, all the development, all the wealth, all the pride of Millbrook Valley, all of it depended on the water flowing through this room, and all of it could be controlled from right here. Some valves were fully open, their wheels turned as far as they would go, allowing maximum flow. Others were partially closed, restricting the water to a trickle, and all of them showed signs of recent maintenance, oiled mechanisms, cleaned handles, the kind of care that only came from regular attention. Thomas had been here, week after week, year after year, climbing down into this chamber, checking each valve, adjusting the flow, keeping the whole system running, keeping the valley's drainage functional, while everyone above thought he was just a crazy old man playing in a swamp. Elowen's flashlight found something mounted on the far wall, a large metal plaque, its surface green with age and moisture. She walked over and wiped it clean with her sleeve, revealing engraved text that made her heart race. Millbrook Valley Central Drainage Works, constructed 1892 by the Valley Water Authority, designed by Chief Engineer Harold Blackwell. This facility controls all water drainage for the Eastern Valley region. Operation of this system is essential for prevention of flooding in developed areas. Below that, in smaller but equally official lettering, all water rights, operational control, and maintenance responsibilities are vested in perpetuity in the legal owner of this property and its associated land. Said owner holds exclusive authority over all valve operations and water flow direction. No public or private entity may override this authority without express written permission of the property owner. Elowen read it 3 times, her legal mind that she'd developed over years of dealing with school bureaucracy, recognizing the ironclad nature of the language. This wasn't a suggestion. This wasn't negotiable. This was law, written into the very construction of the system. Whoever owned this property controlled the water, period. She sat down on a stone bench that had been built into the wall, probably for the original valve keeper to rest during long maintenance sessions. The bench was dry despite the water flowing all around. The chamber was surprisingly well ventilated. She could feel air moving, probably through carefully designed vents that Thomas had kept clear. Her phone buzzed. No signal down here, but the flashlight was draining the battery. She'd need to get proper lighting installed. She'd need to understand every valve, every channel, every consequence of opening or closing each gate. She'd need to become what Thomas had been, the secret keeper of the valley's lifeblood. Elowen stood and walked to the largest valve in the room, a massive wheel mechanism mounted on a vertical shaft that descended into the floor. The wheel was at least 4 feet in diameter, made of cast iron with 6 spokes radiating from a central hub. A brass plate on the wall next to it read, Primary Eastern Valley Drainage, Main Control. Warning, closure of this valve will result in immediate backup of all upstream water flow. Do not close, except in emergency. Below that, someone, Thomas probably, had added a handwritten note in waterproof ink, Emergency, never. This valve controls Henderson, Pratt, and Blackwood primary drainage. Closure would flood all 3 major development areas within 24 hours. Use only as last resort or in case of catastrophic downstream failure. Elowen put both hands on the wheel. The metal was cold, slightly damp, but the mechanism was well maintained. She could feel that it would turn if she applied pressure. She could close this valve right now, right this minute, and tomorrow morning Marcus Henderson would wake up to find his exclusive resort under a foot of water. Robert Pratt's luxury farms would be transformed into rice paddies. James Blackwood's $1 million homes would have flooded basements and ruined landscaping. All it would take was turning this wheel, closing this gate, stopping the flow of water that their entire world depended on. Elowen didn't do it, not because she was afraid, not because she lacked the courage, but because Thomas had taught her something through 30 years of marriage. Real power didn't need to be used to be effective. Real power was most effective when held in reserve, when people knew you could use it but chose not to. Yet, she released the wheel and continued her exploration. She found Thomas's logbook mounted in a waterproof case on the wall, a thick ledger where he'd recorded every valve adjustment, every flow rate change, every maintenance action for 30 years. The latest entry was from 2 days before he died. All valves functioning normally, flow rates optimal, no adjustments needed. The system remains sound. The last sentence was underlined twice. Thomas had known he was dying, had known he might not make it back down here, and his final professional act had been to ensure the system was in perfect condition for whoever came after him, for Elowen. She found technical drawings mounted under glass, showing the entire underground network. It was vast, miles of channels, dozens of junction points, all flowing through this central control room. She found a smaller chamber off the main one, containing backup valve wheels and replacement parts, all carefully organized and labeled. Thomas had thought of everything. He'd prepared everything. He'd left her not just a property, but a fully functional, completely maintained, absolutely essential piece of infrastructure that the entire valley depended on. And he'd kept it secret, because he'd known that if the developers discovered what he controlled, they'd have found a way to take it from him. They'd have used their money, their influence, their political connections to steal what he'd bought legally and maintained faithfully. But they couldn't steal it from Elowen, not anymore, because she knew what she had. She understood the power she held, and she was about to teach the developers of Millbrook Valley a lesson they'd never forget. Never underestimate a widow, especially one who controls your water. Over the next week, Elowen worked to fully understand the system Thomas had left her. She found his detailed notes on how the valve house operated, which gates controlled which properties, and what would happen if various combinations were closed. Thomas had been meticulous. He'd mapped out every consequence. The system was beautifully simple in concept, but devastatingly powerful in practice. The Eastern Valley was built on a slope. Water naturally drained downward from the hills. In the old days, before development, it had spread across the wetlands, creating the swamp. But when people started building farms and eventually resorts in the 1920s and beyond, they needed to drain the water away, or their properties would flood. So they'd built drainage ditches and channels, all of which eventually fed into the ancient underground system that Thomas now controlled. The developers thought they controlled their own drainage. They'd built modern systems on their properties, pipes, culverts, sophisticated networks. But all of those systems ultimately connected to the old central system. The water had to go somewhere, and the somewhere was through Elowen's valve house. Close the gates, and the water had nowhere to go but up. Elowen also discovered something else in Thomas's notes. The developers had been trying to buy her property, not just to have the land, but because they'd recently discovered that their drainage was failing. Their modern systems were backing up. They needed to upgrade the old central system, but to do that they needed to own it. They needed Elowen's property, and they'd assumed she was too ignorant to understand what she had, that she'd sell cheap and they'd get control of the system, without ever admitting they needed it. They'd underestimated the widow of the swamp. On the 8th day after discovering the valve house, Elowen heard vehicles approaching. She looked out and saw Marcus Henderson's SUV, followed by 2 other trucks. Marcus got out, and this time he wasn't pretending to be friendly. "Mrs. Marsh, we need to talk." "Do we?" Elowen came out onto the porch, which she'd repaired enough to be safe. "You've been trespassing on Valley Water Authority property," Marcus said. "That drainage system under your house is public infrastructure." "Is it?" Elowen asked calmly. "Show me the deed that says so." Marcus's jaw tightened. "The deed was lost decades ago. How convenient. I have a deed that says this property and all appurtenances and improvements belong to me. That includes the valve house and all its mechanisms." "You don't even know what you have," Robert Pratt said, stepping forward. "You're playing with things you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Elowen said. "I understand that all your properties depend on drainage controlled from my worthless swamp house. I understand that without proper drainage, your resort floods, your farms flood, your expensive homes flood, And I understand that you've known this for months and have been trying to steal my property rather than negotiate fairly." The three men stared at her in shock. "You can't possibly—" James Blackwood started. Elowen disappeared inside for a moment and returned with a valve wheel she'd disconnected from a secondary line. She held it up. "See this? This controlled drainage for the Henderson Resort property. Past tense, I've closed that line." "You wouldn't," Marcus said, but his face had gone pale. "Wouldn't I? You called me crazy, called my husband crazy, offered me insults disguised as offers. Tried to intimidate an old widow into giving up what you wanted to steal. Why would I help you now?" "Because if you don't," Marcus said, his voice shaking with rage, "we'll bury you in lawsuits. We'll have the county condemn this property. You'll do nothing," Elowen said coldly. "Because the moment you try, I close every valve in that system, and your precious developments are underwater before your lawyers can file the first paper. I control the water, which means I control you." The truth of it settled over them like a weight. "What do you want?" Robert finally asked. "I want you to leave, and when you come back, it won't be with threats. It'll be with respect and a real offer. Not for my property, you'll never own this, but for a proper contract that pays me what this service is worth. You want your drainage, you'll pay me a fair price for maintaining it." "We'll never," Marcus started. Elowen walked to the edge of the porch. "Then start building boats. Because my husband didn't spend 30 years maintaining your drainage out of kindness. He did it because he knew that someday you'd realize you needed it. And now that day has come. I'm not the desperate widow you thought you could push around. I'm the woman who holds your empires in her hands, remember that." She went back inside and closed the door. Through the window, she watched the three developers stand in shocked silence, then slowly return to their vehicles and leave. Elowen sat down in her modest repaired room and laughed. The widow of the swamp had just declared war on the most powerful men in the valley, and she was going to win. The developers tried everything. First, they attempted legal action, filing for an easement that would give them access to the valve house. Elowen's lawyer demolished the filing, pointing out that no easement had existed for over 100 years, and they couldn't create one retroactively. Then they tried going to the county government, demanding that Elowen's property be condemned as a public health hazard. The inspection came, and while the house was indeed in poor condition, it didn't meet the legal threshold for condemnation. Elowen had made just enough repairs to keep it marginally habitable. Throughout all of this, Elowen kept one valve partially closed, the one serving Marcus Henderson's resort. Not enough to flood it, but enough to cause drainage problems. Enough to remind Marcus that she held the power. The resort started having issues. Lawns stayed soggy. The golf course developed standing water. Guest complaints increased. Marcus was hemorrhaging money and reputation. Finally, 6 weeks after their confrontation, Marcus returned to Elowen's property. Alone this time. No entourage. No threats. He knocked on the door and waited for permission to enter. Elowen made him wait a full minute before opening it. "Mr. Henderson, Mrs. Marsh, may I come in?" Elowen stepped aside. Marcus entered and looked around at the modest repairs she'd made. The room was clean and dry now. Simple furniture, a functioning wood stove. Nothing fancy, but dignified. "I came to apologize," Marcus said, "for how we treated you, for the assumptions we made. You were right. We tried to take advantage of you. Yes, you did. And now we're asking, respectfully, for a contract. A real one. That pays you fairly for maintaining the drainage system that our properties depend on." Elowen gestured for him to sit. "I'm listening." They negotiated for 2 hours. Elowen had Thomas's detailed notes on what the service was worth. She knew the property values, knew the revenue the developments generated, knew exactly how much they needed her. In the end, they agreed on a contract that paid Elowen $50,000 per year, plus a percentage of any new development that used the system. In addition, the developers would pay for complete restoration of her house, not to tear it down but to restore it to full functionality while preserving its historic character. Marcus signed the contract with shaking hands. "You've won," he said quietly. "This must feel good." "This isn't about winning," Elowen said. "This is about being respected, about fair value for real service. My husband maintained your drainage for 30 years, and you never even knew. Now you'll know, you'll pay, and you'll remember that the widow in the swamp holds the key to everything you've built." Marcus left, and over the following months the transformation began. Professional contractors came to restore the house. They worked under Elowen's supervision, preserving the 1890 structure while making it livable. They stabilized the foundation, repaired the roof, restored the walls. They added modern utilities, but hid them carefully behind period details. The valve house below was professionally serviced and upgraded. New safety features were added, but the essential Victorian-era mechanisms were preserved and maintained. The property became what it had always been meant to be, a functional, beautiful valve keeper's house. Elowen didn't leave the swamp. She stayed there, living in the restored house, maintaining the system, and collecting her fees. The developers paid on time, every time, because they knew what would happen if they didn't. And Elowen, who'd been called crazy, who'd been laughed at, who'd been offered crumbs for what turned out to be a kingdom, sat in her restored house in the center of the swamp and knew that Thomas had left her the greatest gift possible. Not just security, not just money, but the proof that what everyone dismisses as worthless might be the thing that holds all the power. The widow of the swamp had become the queen of the valley, and nobody would ever underestimate her again. If this story moved you, leave one word in the comments, and remember, those who mock the grieving don't know what strength they're awakening. Those who try to steal from the widow don't know what power they're challenging, and those who think a woman alone is vulnerable have never met a woman who's discovered she controls everything they need. Elowen's story proves that real power isn't loud. It's quiet. It's patient. It's knowing what you hold while others think you have nothing. And when they finally realize the truth, it's already too late. You've already won. 5 years after discovering the valve house, Elowen stood on the fully restored porch of her house and looked out over the swamp that had become her kingdom. The house behind her was beautiful now, every board replaced or restored, every window gleaming, the foundation stabilized with modern engineering that respected the Victorian structure. The house was painted in its original colors, cream with dark green trim, exactly as it had looked in 1892 when the first valve keeper moved in. But it wasn't just pretty, it was powerful, because everyone who saw it now knew what it represented. The money had changed Elowen's life in practical ways. The $50,000 annual fee, plus percentages from new development, had made her wealthy. She'd invested wisely, lived comfortably, and used some of the money to create something Thomas would have been proud of. She'd established the Thomas Marsh Water Conservation Foundation, which provided grants for wetland preservation and taught young engineers about sustainable water management. But the money wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was the respect. Marcus Henderson no longer drove past her property with contempt. He stopped to ask permission if he needed any valve adjustments for his resort. Robert Pratt sent her a Christmas card every year, thanking her for her stewardship of the system. James Blackwood had publicly apologized at a town council meeting for how he'd treated her. They'd learned the hard way. 6 months after their initial contract, Marcus had tried to test her. He'd been late with a payment, apparently thinking she'd be too polite to enforce consequences. Elowen had partially closed his drainage valve. Within 12 hours, the resort's golf course was waterlogged. Marcus had called her in a panic. "What are you doing?" "I'm maintaining the system according to our contract, which states that services are contingent on timely payment. Your payment is 3 days late." "It's just a few days, I was traveling." "Then you should have arranged for on-time payment. The valve will reopen when I receive full payment, plus the late fee specified in paragraph 7 of our agreement." This is extortion. This is contract enforcement. Pay or pump. Marcus had paid within 2 hours, and he'd never been late again. Word spread. The widow of the swamp didn't make empty threats. The widow of the swamp controlled the water, and the water controlled everything. But Elowen hadn't become a tyrant. She was fair. She maintained the system excellently. She even improved it, using her fees to hire professional engineers who upgraded components while preserving the historic mechanisms. She added modern sensors and monitoring equipment that allowed her to track flow rates from her house. She digitized Thomas's logbooks and created a comprehensive database of the entire system. She did it all correctly, professionally, ethically, which made her power even more absolute, because nobody could claim she was unreasonable. She was just competent. And competence, when combined with control of essential resources, was unbeatable. The town's attitude toward her had transformed completely. The same people who'd pitied her at Thomas's funeral now treated her like royalty. She was invited to every important event. Her opinion was sought on development proposals. The mayor consulted her on water management issues. She'd become quietly and completely one of the most powerful people in Millbrook Valley. Not because she was loud, not because she was aggressive, but because she controlled something everyone needed, and she'd proven she would use that control if disrespected. One afternoon, a young couple came to visit her. They were in their early 30s, standing nervously on her porch, clearly intimidated. "Mrs. Marsh, I'm Emma Rivera, and this is my husband Carlos. We're hoping to buy some land in the valley and build a small home. We were told we need to speak with you." Elowen invited them in and made coffee. As they sat in her comfortable living room, a far cry from the moldy disaster it had been 5 years ago, she asked about their plans. They wanted 2 acres on the eastern slope, nothing fancy, just a home for their growing family. "The land we want is in the Henderson Drainage District," Emma said, "which means we need your approval." "Not my approval," Elowen corrected gently. "The land can drain through the system regardless. But if you want to connect directly to the main channels, yes, we need to discuss terms." "We don't have much money," Carlos admitted. "We're not developers, just a family." Elowen smiled. "Then your fee is very simple. You'll pay $100 per year for maintenance access to the system. And in exchange, I ask one thing. If you see anyone dumping waste or pollutants that could affect the water quality, you report it to me immediately. This system has run clean for over 100 years. I intend to keep it that way." The couple stared at her. "100, that's all?" "That's all. You're not a resort charging $500 per night per room. You're a family building a home. The fee should reflect that." They left with tears of gratitude, and Elowen felt Thomas's presence strongly. This was what he'd wanted. Not power for power's sake, but the ability to ensure the system was used fairly, maintained properly, and protected from those who would exploit it for profit while giving nothing back. As the sun set that evening, Elowen made her daily walk to the valve house. She descended the stone steps, much easier now with the electric lighting she'd installed, and checked each valve, recording flow rates in her digital log. The underground chamber had become like a chapel to her, a place of quiet meditation where she connected with Thomas's memory and with the generations of valve keepers who'd come before. She touched the largest valve wheel and thought about the day she'd discovered this place, about how close she'd come to selling the property out of desperation, about how different her life would be if she'd accepted Marcus's first insulting offer. But she hadn't. She'd trusted Thomas, she'd done the work, she'd fought for what was hers, and now she stood here in control, respected, secure. At 67, Thomas had died thinking he'd left her alone and vulnerable, but he'd actually left her armed with the most powerful weapon possible, essential control over resources that everyone needed. The developers who'd laughed at the widow of the swamp would never laugh again, because the swamp wasn't a curse, it was a fortress, and Elowen was its queen. 10 years after Thomas's death, the Millbrook Valley Historical Society held a special ceremony. They were dedicating a plaque at Elowen's property, officially recognizing the valve house as a historic landmark and Elowen as its keeper. The ceremony was attended by everyone who mattered in the valley. Marcus Henderson gave a speech about the importance of preserving historic infrastructure. Robert Pratt talked about sustainable water management. James Blackwood presented Elowen with a framed resolution from the town council honoring her stewardship. Elowen stood before the crowd. Over 100 people gathered on her property and gave a short speech. "When my husband Thomas died, I thought I'd lost everything. He'd spent our savings on what everyone called a worthless swamp. I was alone, broke, and facing a future that looked very bleak. The powerful people of this valley saw me as an obstacle to remove, a problem to solve with a small check and empty sympathy. She paused, looking at the faces before her. Many looked uncomfortable, remembering how they'd treated her. But Thomas left me something more valuable than money. He left me purpose. He left me the knowledge that what looks worthless to everyone else might be the thing that holds real value. And he left me this system, this beautiful, functional, essential piece of engineering that has served this valley for over 130 years. She gestured to the valve house entrance, now preserved behind a protective glass enclosure that let visitors see the historic entrance while keeping it secure. I've spent 10 years maintaining what Thomas protected for 30, and I'll spend whatever years I have left doing the same. Not because I need the money anymore, but because this system deserves respect, because the people who built it in 1892 deserves to be remembered, and because every person in this valley, rich or poor, deserves fair access to the water that makes life here possible. She looked directly at Marcus Henderson. I've learned that power used wisely benefits everyone, that strength doesn't require cruelty, and that being underestimated is sometimes the greatest advantage you can have. The crowd applauded, and Elowen saw tears in some eyes. She'd transformed from the pitied widow into a symbol of resilience. The ceremony ended with the unveiling of the plaque, the Thomas and Elowen Marsh Valve House, Esterta 1892, continuously operated for over 130 years. This facility represents the dedication of those who maintain essential services without recognition and the wisdom of those who see value where others see only obstacles. May it stand for another century as a reminder that real wealth flows from stewardship, not ownership. That night, Elowen sat alone in her house looking at old photos of Thomas. "We did it," she told his image. "They respect us now. They understand what you knew all along. The swamp was never worthless. It was priceless. And you gave it to me with faith that I'd figure out why." She walked outside one last time, breathing the swamp air that had once seemed like a curse, but now smelled like home. The frogs sang their evening chorus. The water moved through its ancient channels beneath her feet. And Elowen smiled, knowing that she'd taken what everyone called ruin and transformed it into legacy. The widow of the swamp had become the guardian of the valley, and her story would be told for generations. Never underestimate a woman who's lost everything, because she has nothing left to lose and everything to prove. And when she discovers that what you mocked is what you need, she'll teach you the most expensive lesson you'll ever learn. Elowen's swamp wasn't a grave, it was a throne. And she ruled it with wisdom, justice, and the quiet satisfaction of a woman who knew her worth when everyone else thought she was worthless. Years later, when journalists came to interview Elowen about her remarkable story, they always asked the same question: "Did you ever consider just taking the money and leaving?" Elowen's answer was always the same, every single day at first. "When I was living in a moldy room with water seeping through the floor, eating canned soup by lantern light, covered in mosquito bites, and exhausted from digging in the mud, yes, I thought about quitting, about taking Marcus Henderson's money and getting a small apartment somewhere comfortable, about accepting that Thomas had made a mistake and I should cut my losses." She'd pause, then smile. "But I'd made Thomas a promise 30 years earlier, on our wedding day, for better or worse. In prosperity and adversity, he'd kept that promise to me every day of our marriage. So when he left me that swamp, that impossible situation, that test of faith, I owed it to him to keep my promise too, to trust him, to do the work, to believe there was a reason." The journalists would inevitably ask about the moment everything changed, when she found the valve house. "It wasn't just finding the valves," Elowen would explain. "It was understanding what Thomas had been trying to teach me our entire marriage. That value isn't determined by what everyone else thinks. That power comes from controlling what's essential, not what's expensive. That patience and faith can triumph over money and arrogance every single time." Her story inspired countless others. Books were written, a documentary was filmed, business schools taught case studies about how she'd turned leverage into lasting success. But Elowen herself remained remarkably unchanged by the attention. She still lived in the same restored house, still made her daily walks to check the valves, still charged fair fees and treated small homeowners and major developers by the same standards of respect and responsibility. When she turned 80, the valley threw her a massive celebration. Over 500 people attended. 3 governors sent congratulatory letters. The head of the National Historic Preservation Society gave a speech calling her the embodiment of stewardship done right. At the end of the evening, a young woman approached Elowen, a college student studying environmental engineering. "Mrs. Marsh, how did you find the courage to stand up to all those powerful men? Weren't you afraid?" Elowen thought about that question for a long moment. "I was terrified," she finally answered, "every single day. But here's what I learned. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done despite the fear. And when you're fighting for something bigger than yourself, for justice, for legacy, for the principle that people should be treated fairly, the fear becomes secondary." She looked at the young woman. "They tried to make me feel small, worthless, desperate, but I'd been married to a genius for 42 years. I'd watched him work with quiet confidence, never needing validation from people who wouldn't understand his vision anyway. So I channeled him. I asked myself what Thomas would do, and the answer was always the same. The work. Just do the work. Maintain the system. Stand firm. Let the results speak." The young woman had tears in her eyes. "Thank you. I needed to hear that." Elowen smiled. "Then let me tell you one more thing. Every person who's ever done something important has faced people who said it was impossible, worthless, crazy. The difference between those who succeed and those who give up isn't talent or luck. It's stubbornness. It's the refusal to let other people's limitations become your own. You decide what's possible, nobody else." She looked around at the celebration, at the community that had once mocked her and now honored her. "I was 67 years old when Thomas died. Everyone thought my life was over, that I was too old, too weak, too poor to matter. But I'm 80 now, and these have been the most powerful, purposeful, satisfying 13 years of my life. It's never too late to discover that what you thought was your ending is actually your beginning." That night, alone again in her house, Elowen made one final entry in the Valve House logbook, a tradition she'd maintained for 13 years. All systems functioning perfectly, flow rates optimal. The valley is secure. This old widow has kept faith with her husband's vision and with the generations of keepers who came before. May whoever comes after me remember, the swamp is not a curse. It's a gift. Use it wisely. Elowen Marsh, keeper of the valves, guardian of the flow, widow of the swamp, queen of the valley.